I decided to make another video here. It is May 31st, 2018, and it's been about 5 months or 5.5 months since the Sundance television station put on their two-part documentary that they wanted to present about going back to In Cold Blood some 60 years later, and talking to the KBI and Mr. Dewey's son and a couple of authors that have written books concerning this matter, and people, Gerald Clark and well-known people like that, and they're very famous, and they've made a lot of money off of their books concerning Truman Capote and In Cold Blood and their own works and stuff, and that's fine. So they got on there and they talked quite a bit about interviewing different people that actually knew the Clutter family, relatives and very close friends, and Bobby Rupp and quite a few people out there in Garden City that still are alive, that were very closely associated with the family and at the time of the murders, and looking back on their recollections of all of the family members and what they remembered about each one and how they felt. And I found that to be very rewarding, and I was very grateful that the family members and friends that actually knew these people were willing to come on and be so very transparent with their feelings and recollections, and I really appreciated that, because I can only imagine how difficult that still is at this point in their lives to talk about that. So I felt like that was very brave. I also thought that the last part, before it ended, they had a individual older man that identified himself in what he said. He truly believed that he is the living son of Perry Edward Smith, and I thought it took an exceptional amount of courage on his part to come forward and to talk about that and say that, based on everything that he knows about and his physical appearance and what Perry Smith looked like and the timing of it and his age, etc., that he was very confident that that was probably the case. And one thing that I don't think that was said on his behalf, and maybe it doesn't need to be said, maybe he's just trying to settle accounts like I am. I just thought that, you know, even if he is, and he probably is, Perry Smith's son, he is not responsible for any of the things that Perry Smith did. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I just came away from that thinking that this guy has had to live with that for all these years, which I can't even imagine. But I am hopeful that perhaps he's been able to have his own life in spite of his background. So saying that, what am I doing this video for, and why should you bother to watch it? Okay, I'm not famous. I never claimed to be famous. I'm never going to be famous, and that's fine, because I know who I am as a human being and as a person and as a man. But I did want to take just a few minutes to back up the clock one more time and talk about some of the things that Sundance television station didn't cover, didn't think it was important to cover, omitted, or all of the above. I don't care how you put it. It doesn't really make any difference. It wasn't addressed in their documentary. And I just have had about enough of the arrogance of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation being so smug about their contribution to the solving of the Clutter murders and their perception and storyline connected to Alvin Dewey and Harold Nye and the other two agents out there, Clarence Dunce and I'm sorry, I can't remember the agent. Anyway, at this point, it really doesn't make any difference. The fact of the matter is, and this wasn't talked about, you know, they just want to take all the credit in the world for solving this crime. There was a young man in Kansas City, Kansas, and he was working at a department store up there when Richard Hickok and Perry Smith came back through Kansas City the second time, right under the noses of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. And they were writing all these hot checks for all these other items so that they could take them with them to Florida, which they did. Now, this young man, a salesman, you know, back then you probably made 30 cents an hour, working on the weekend, trying to earn a paycheck. He had the smarts, the savvy, after Richard Hickok gave him this check for this television set, to look out the window and see what car Smith and Hickok put the TV set in, and he wrote down the license plate of that black and white Chevrolet that Dick Hickok stole up there in Iowa. And Hickok had gone over to some car agency that he used to work at. When they came back through Kansas City the second time, after leaving down through Iowa and on their journey south to make their great escape down to Florida for Christmas. And if it wouldn't have been for that young man in that department store writing down that the license plate there of that car, the KBI might have never found those two guys, because they didn't know that they had a stolen car, and they didn't know what the license plate was, and they didn't know much of anything, quite frankly. And it's not so much that it wasn't an attempt to find out, that's just the facts of the matter. And once they did find out what that was, then they called out this great big manhunt over 17 states, telling everybody, be on the lookout for this black and white Chevrolet with this license plate on it. And that's how those two guys got picked up there in Las Vegas, Nevada, by a couple of beat cops out there in Las Vegas. And the thing that I want to go on just a little bit about that is the just really bullshit that Mr. Dewey and Mr. Nye of the KBI during this ongoing investigation, their involvement during this as the lead investigators of this crime with Truman Capote and Harper Lee were disgraceful. And I'll tell you something, why that was. On December 30th, 1959, while Capote and Harper Lee were sitting over there at Alvin Dewey's house with Marie Dewey and the kids, eating dinner, about 8 o'clock at night the telephone rang. It wasn't the Las Vegas Police Department. It was Harold Nye of the KBI who was working that case. He was a bloodhound, and he had been tracking Smith and Hickok since that murder, all by himself. He went alone out west and into California, Idaho, Nevada, all the places that he could think of that they might be at and who might know where they're at, etc., etc. He was a really good detective at one time. And he called Alvin Dewey to tell him that Hickok and Smith were in the Las Vegas jail out there, and they'd been picked up, and he wanted Dewey and Clarence Dunce, and the other, I'm sorry, I can't remember the other KBI agent. There were 4 of them out there. They went on out there in the cars from Garden City, the 3 of them, and they went out there in 2 separate cars and went out to Las Vegas, and that's when those interviews took place down there in the Las Vegas Police Department. But that's how that went. And as soon as Dewey received that phone call, he immediately told Harper Lee and Truman Capote all about it. They had absolutely no business knowing anything about that investigation, and he was just filling them all in as fast as he could about all the details. You talk about unethical, you talk about something that's just absolutely wrong. I don't know how much wrong it could get. Okay, that's when Capote begged Dewey to take him with him out there to Las Vegas, Nevada. Can't you see that? Yeah, here's Truman Capote sitting in the back seat, you know, with the killers or whatever, right along with the KBI. God. Okay, yeah. That wasn't a part of their documentary. They didn't talk about that. That got buried along with a lot of these other things that actually happened. On the 4th of January, after arriving out there in Las Vegas, Hickok confessed to the KBI in Las Vegas that day. And late that night, Alvin Dewey called his house and spoke directly to Truman Capote about Hickok's confession. It was Nancy Clutter's birthday on that day, on the 4th of January 1960, and the girl would have been 17 years old that day. But here is Alvin Dewey on the telephone talking to this writer about all the details of Hickok's confession on the telephone. This is an open investigation. They haven't even been indicted. This is ongoing. All of this is confidential. But you didn't see any of that on this Sundance production. And I think it's about time that some of this crap that nobody wants to talk about, that everybody wants to cover up, everybody wants to ignore, yeah, well, let's hang out the laundry and let the people see what really happened. How was In Cold Blood, the masterpiece, really written, and who was responsible for the content, and how did that story really get done? Now I'm going to shift gears for a second, and I don't know if anybody else that's ever looked into this story ever came across the name of a writer named J.J. Maloney. J.J. Maloney was an ex-con that had done time in the Missouri State Penitentiary for murder. And he was released, and he was a very bright guy. And once he got out, he became a very, very good investigative reporter for the Kansas City Star up there in Kansas City, Missouri, and also later on out in California. And he received quite a bit of attention while he wrote different articles, and he was a very respected reporter. He died, unfortunately, in 1999. But I read some things that he wrote, and he wrote an article about In Cold Blood and called it a dishonest book. Well, I think that's being really lenient. I would have really liked to have talked to Mr. Maloney and shown him all of the research that I have on this subject, and talked to him in depth while he was still alive, because he would have been the kind of reporter that probably could have helped to maybe solve this entire situation of what I believe really happened out there at that farmhouse in November of 1959. And the reason I'm bringing that up is, if you listen to the family members and the close friends of the Clutter family that spoke on that Sundance Productions documentary, there is some tremendous doubt and uncertainty in that family even today as to why their family, Bonnie Clutter, Herb Clutter, Kenyon, and the girl were killed today, 60 years later. They're not confident that this story found in this book and sold over and over and over and over with the KBI and the Kansas Attorney General's office, it doesn't ring true to them. And no, I'm not a famous writer, okay? But I'll tell you one thing, there is something immensely wrong with what happened out there and didn't get written compared to this story that's been pawned off on people for the last 60 years. And eventually, and I'm going to say this on record, eventually, this may be after I die, so be it. But you know what? I wrote about this, and I made these videos about this, and one of these days, there's going to be somebody that comes along, and they're going to turn over a rock, and under that rock is going to be some secrets, okay, that people have tried to keep hidden for about 60 years. And when that happens, you're going to find out that I was right about this in what I've told you, okay? That's what's going to happen here. Mark it down. I don't want to waste your time, okay? And I'm hopeful that some of the people that have been reading or watching these videos, according to what I've seen, over 6,000 people have viewed these, at least some parts of them. I don't know if they've actually watched all of them, but they certainly have watched a whole bunch of them. And I appreciate that, I really do. You know, for whatever your reason is, you're curious, you just want to know, maybe you live out there, maybe you've heard about this case, maybe you're older like I am and can remember these people, maybe you're young and you're studying criminology. I'll tell you one thing that's really interesting about In Cold Blood, that book. That started being used in the training of how to solve a crime in the FBI and the KBI and police stations and police forces around the country. They were putting that up as a state-of-the-art manual, if you will, on how to solve a real crime. And it was used like that for a long time. The problem is, did they really solve that crime? I'm not talking about hanging the right two people. I'm talking about the reason why those people were killed. If the people that knew them in person are still, and you could see it in their faces, very uneasy, okay? Haunted, if you will, by why this family was executed. Because that's what happened to them. They weren't randomly killed. Okay, just a couple other things going back to the original scenario of how this developed. Okay, in January, after the two killers come back to Garden City, and they're over there in the Garden City jail, there were two occasions where Truman Capote and Harper Lee went into Alvin Dewey's office there in Garden City, and they interviewed Hickok and Smith in person after Truman Capote wrote a check for $50 to pay each man $25 to talk to them for a half an hour or something like that. Now they did that twice. None of the Kansas newspaper men, like the Hutchinson News or the Wichita Eagle or the Kansas City Star or even the local people at Garden City, were permitted to do that. It was later when they permitted them to talk to Smith and Hickok, but it certainly wasn't in Alvin Dewey's office. Like Nell Harper Lee and Truman Capote were given the opportunity because they knew Alvin Dewey, and he was the one that permitted them to do it. There's another thing I want people to realize. Harold Nye, this is the bloodhound that went all the way out there to California and talked to Smith's sister and tried to find out what she knew about where he was at or where he might be, etc., etc. I mean, he was on top of this case. This guy worked hours, sometimes days, without sleeping on this case. He was the real deal. And I have no doubt that Harold Nye at one time was a great cop. But I'll tell you something. When he came back to Garden City, he started falling in with Alvin Dewey. And what I mean by that is this. He provided Harper Lee with the entire, listen to this, on January 13th, Harold Nye gave Harper Lee all the information related to the investigation on his travels, including talking to Smith's sister in San Francisco. He gave Harper Lee inventory from the stolen car recovered in Las Vegas, gave Hickok's interrogation for Harper Lee for her to copy, and gave her comments to clarify the suspect's remarks. In other words, his own notes. Look, I've been around a lot of really good cops, and I'm going to tell you something. This kind of crossing the line is where police officers not only lose their jobs, but they can get charged with interfering with an investigation. Okay? This is real serious business that these boys were dancing around with back there in Garden City, Kansas, with Harper Lee and Truman Capote, and they just didn't think anybody'd ever find this out. And there's some other stuff about Harold and I that I'm going to bring up right now. I might as well let both shoes fall. Okay? Let's just go ahead and clear the air on this thing. Harold and I later on became the Kansas Bureau of Investigation Director. Okay? Great. Swell. But before he left that organization, he went into the archives section of the KBI, and that's off limits to everybody. You have to have special clearance to get into there. Well, he was the director, so I suppose he had clearance for everything. And he took a camera with him, okay? And he went in there and he photographed a bunch of files. And he copied a bunch of confidential KBI files, okay, that belonged to the state of Kansas, that were used in the prosecution in this case against Smith and Hickok. And he took all that stuff with him back to his house after he retired. Do you know how illegal that is? There isn't any room about it. That's illegal. I don't care if he was the director or not. Okay? That's stealing. Yeah, that's stealing state property and putting it in a box and taking it home with you. I just thought people might want to know that, since how we're talking about how the KBI handled all this case and what really happened with that. Okay? They're very lucky that those two cops out in Las Vegas that were just doing patrol saw that car parked over there and approached that car that night and got both of those killers out of there and put them in handcuffs and took them to jail. But you don't hear anything about that. Okay? They're the ones that found the trunk in the car that belonged to Perry Smith, that idiot that sent his boots back from Mexico to the bus station there in Las Vegas, and they still had blood on them from Herb Clutter that was used at the trial, okay, to convict Hickok and Smith with. But you don't hear too much about the Las Vegas Police Department and their end in this solving of this crime. But they're the ones that picked those guys up, and they're the ones that held them there until the KBI could get out there to interview them. And then they basically, I guess, were hands off. One of the last things I'm going to tell you, and then I'll just let this tape run out. In 1960, this is a very interesting point. In 1960, in October, Truman Capote obtained all of the FBI relative files to the Clutter case. that contained the confessions of Hickok and Smith, etc., etc., etc. Okay, Truman Capote was not an employee of the FBI. Truman Capote had no business acquiring those files or copies of those files. And I find it very, very interesting that Mr. Truman Capote weaseled his way in through whatever means, and there were plenty of people. Alvin Dewey worked for the FBI at one time. So did Charles McAtee, who worked up there in the Department of Corrections for the state of Kansas and was the Kansas penal director. He had worked in the FBI too. So I don't know how Mr. Truman Capote obtained those confidential files that are off limits to the public, but he got them. And I guess I just wanted people to know that, you know, this whole story about this, it still riles me. And it's not just because of my father's story being stolen and used to write in cold blood, and Random House says they don't know nothing about it, even though Bennett Cerf, okay, yeah, let's talk about that guy for a second, okay, the great editor and stuff, publisher of Random House up there, okay, well, there was another lady here way back in the 1930s named Sonora Babb. She came from Oklahoma, and she did a series of top-notch interviews with people out in California, Okies, that had traveled all the way out there from Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas and Arkansas to escape the Depression and go out there and pick fruit, even though they were never going to make any money. Most of them starved to death out there. She was out there and she interviewed those people, and she was writing down all of her interviews, and her co-worker, this guy that she worked for out there in California, took her notes and gave them to John Steinbeck, who used those notes to help him write the Grapes of Wrath. And Sonora Babb had written this beautiful account of this story of these people, and it got shelved in New York by Bennett Cerf. Okay? Now, Bennett Cerf was the same guy that is directly involved with In Cold Blood and had first-hand knowledge of machinations and High Road to Hell. So, you know, I mean, let's just kind of put things out there where they belong, shall we? Okay? I mean, nobody knows about this. Nobody heard about this. Nobody's seen any of this. What a bunch of crap. Okay? So, listen, I hope the people that wanted to watch this stuff, ultimately, I hope you will buy a copy of that expose that I spent a long time in researching and writing for 25 bucks. I think it's a very minimal price for the amount of information that's in there. And there's a very separate story in there about my father that's very interesting while he worked for the governor of Kansas back in 1955. It's very extraordinary. At least I think it is. So if you don't buy it, that's okay. And if you do buy it, I'd appreciate it. Either way, it's written and it's copyrighted. So one thing that people can say later on is, hey, I remember that guy telling me about that, and he was right. So I hope that you guys have a really good day. Thank you for watching the final video. At least I think it will be, and I appreciate it. Thanks for your interest. Thanks for all your support, and I hope you watch this video too. Thank you.